Ever wonder why Jackie Kennedy, a young, healthy woman, kept having miscarriages and stillbirths? Jackie didn't have bad luck with her pregnancies. She had a husband who gave her venereal diseases. Jack Kennedy brought these infections home from his affairs, and they wrecked Jackie's ability to carry a child. The stillbirths, the dead babies, that was direct damage caused by Jack. And the only reason she didn't divorce him? Because reportedly his father, Joe Kennedy, paid her $1 million in cold, hard cash to stay and produce an heir. Pathology, rather than scandal, turned this marriage into a medical crisis. Stripping away the nostalgia reveals a Kennedy dynasty built on three unforgiving axes. It began with the physical corruption, a colossal gap between the vigor Jack sold to voters and the venereal decay of his own body. This was sustained by the economics of silence, where the Kennedy fortune was weaponized to buy compliance rather than cure the problem. At the heart of it lay a fatal flaw: Jack's reckless, chemically fueled appetite colliding with Jackie's paralyzing need for security. This was never merely a series of unfortunate events. It was a system. The trail of tiny coffins lining the Kennedy plot at Arlington leads directly back to the source of the infection: Jack Kennedy's youth in the 1940s. Long before he was a senator, Jack was a sailor. And long before he was a statesman, he was a man for whom sex was less about intimacy and more a sport of conquest. But unlike other young men of his era, Jack's body was already a compromised vessel. According to biographers like Seymour Hersh and medical records unsealed decades after his death, Jack suffered from nonspecific urethritis and recurring burning during urination starting in his late teens. In the medical landscape of the 1940s, the pre-antibiotic era, this was a dangerous reality. Penicillin was a new miracle, largely reserved for the battlefield until the war ended. At home, venereal diseases like gonorrhea and chlamydia were the silent scourges of the upper class. Treatments were crude, painful, and often ineffective, involving irrigation and sulfa drugs that suppress symptoms without eradicating the bacteria. In men, these pathogens are cunning. They can retreat into the prostate gland, causing a condition known as chronic prostatitis. The acute pain fades, the discharge stops, and the man believes he is cured. But he is not cured. He becomes a carrier. He becomes a walking petri dish, functional and charismatic, but biologically a loaded weapon. But the infection was only half of the equation. The other half was the fuel. Jack suffered from Addison's disease, a degenerative failure of the adrenal glands that should have killed him. To survive, to simply stand upright and smile for the cameras, he required daily massive doses of corticosteroids and testosterone supplements. These drugs saved his life, but they came with a side effect that would prove disastrous. For any woman he married, they created a state of hypersexuality. The cocktail of drugs Jack ingested didn't just manage his pain, it ramped up his libido to pathological levels. He wasn't just promiscuous by choice or moral failing. He was chemically driven. He spoke to friends of needing sex every day to stave off blinding headaches. It was a compulsion, a physical itch that needed constant scratching. So by the early 1950s, you have a man with a chemically enhanced drive seeking out hundreds of anonymous partners while carrying a reservoir of untreated venereal infections. This was the man who decided it was time to find a wife. The asymmetry of this biological warfare was devastating. What is a minor annoyance for a man, a slight burning, a discomfort, is a destroyer of worlds for a woman. When these specific bacteria enter the female reproductive tract, they ascend. They do not stay in the lower tract. They climb the cervix and inflame the lining of the uterus, a condition called endometritis. They scar the delicate cilia of the fallopian tubes. They turn the womb, the very place designed to nurture life, into a hostile, inflamed environment. In such an environment, a fertilized egg struggles to attach. If it does attach, the inflammation attacks the placenta, cutting off oxygen, leading to miscarriage or stillbirth. This was the invisible dowry Jack Kennedy brought to his future bride. He was offering her a life of unimaginable privilege, but physically, he was handing her a sentence of reproductive failure. Enter Jacqueline Bouvier. She was the catch of the season, 23 years old, cultured, athletic, and speaking fluent French. She possessed the wide hips of a horsewoman, a trait that the matriarchs of society viewed as a sign of a woman built for easy childbearing. She was worldly in art and literature, but biologically, she was tragically naive. She came from a world where sexual health was never discussed, where women were taught that their duty was to be chaste until marriage and then to submit to their husbands. She had no concept of nonspecific urethritis. She didn't know that the handsome senator courting her was carrying a microbial load that could ruin her life. But the tragedy is that someone knew. The medical community surrounding the Kennedy family knew. The files were there. The treatments were documented. But in the 1950s, the Bro Code extended to the medical profession. Powerful men protected powerful men. To reveal a senator's STD status to his fiancée would have been a breach of privacy and a political assassination. There is a story that haunts this narrative, a moment where the tragedy could have been averted. Before the engagement was announced, a family physician who knew the Kennedy boys' medical history intimately quietly approached Jackie's mother, Janet Auchincloss. He didn't use the taboo words like gonorrhea. Instead, he used the polite euphemisms of the time. He warned her that Jack's past and his constitution might make motherhood difficult for Jackie. Janet heard the warning. She understood the implication, but she also saw the Kennedy millions. She saw the Senate seat. She saw the potential for the White House. The warning was dismissed as gossip. The ambition of the mother overruled the safety of the daughter. And so, on September 12, 1953, the trap was sprung. The wedding in Newport was the social event of the decade. Thousands of spectators cheered as Jack and Jackie knelt at the altar. They looked like the perfect couple, the embodiment of the future. But as they exchanged vows promising to love and to cherish, the biological clock began to tick down towards disaster. Within months of regular sexual contact with her husband, the vibrant, athletic Jackie began to change. The woman who rarely saw a doctor began to feel constantly tired. She began to suffer from vague pelvic pains that the doctors would dismiss as nerves. The bacteria had found its new host. The activation had begun. And the first victims of this toxic symbiosis would not be Jackie herself, but the children she tried so desperately to create. The nightmare of the 1950s had officially begun. The public mythology of the Kennedy marriage began the moment they stepped away from the altar in Newport, but the biological reality began the moment they boarded the plane to Acapulco. History records this honeymoon as a golden interlude, 2 weeks of sun, sea, and romance for the most photogenic couple in the Western world. The Life magazine spread showed them gazing adoringly at one another against the backdrop of the Mexican Pacific, the very image of a modern fairy tale. But if we peel back the glossy emulsion of those photographs, we find a scenario that resembles a horror story more than a romance. From the very first night, the dynamic of the marriage was set. Ideally a union of mutual intimacy, it immediately devolved into a relationship of patient and nurse. Jack Kennedy was more than a husband. He was a crumbling physical specimen. The journey to Acapulco triggered a catastrophic flare-up of his spinal issues. The man who had stood tall at the altar, propped up by adrenaline and a rigid back brace, collapsed the moment the performance was over. For Jackie, the disillusionment was immediate and visceral. She had married a war hero, a symbol of vigor. What she found in the bridal suite was a man in agony, surrounded by a portable pharmacy. The honeymoon suite smelled not of ocean air, but of antiseptic and stale sweat. Jack spent the majority of the trip heavily medicated, his mood swinging violently between the lethargy of opiates and the irritability of pain. But there was a darker chemical element at play here. To counteract the exhaustion of his Addison's disease and the trauma of his back, Jack was continuing his regimen of corticosteroids and testosterone. This chemical cocktail created a terrifying paradox: a man who was physically incapacitated by pain, yet driven by a chemically induced hyperactive libido. He demanded sexual gratification as a form of pain relief, a way to prove he was still alive, still a man. For Jackie, 24 years old and romantically inexperienced, raised with a Victorian view of marital love, this was a brutal awakening. She was not being made love to. She was being used as a vessel for his frustration and his chemically amplified urges. And in those intimate one-sided encounters in the heat of Acapulco, the transfer was happening. The bacterial reservoir that Jack had cultivated in the brothels of Harlem and the apartments of London was crossing the biological barrier. The contamination of the host had begun. When the couple returned to Washington, D.C. to assume their role as the golden couple of the Senate, the domestic reality was even bleaker than the honeymoon. They moved into Hickory Hill, a grand estate that should have been a nest for a newlywed couple. Instead, it became a lonely outpost for Jackie and a campaign headquarters for Jack. The social pressure on Jackie was immense. She was expected to master the art of being a Senate wife, the dinners, the handshakes, the constant scrutiny. But physically, she was beginning to falter. The transition was subtle at first, masked by the exhaustion of her new schedule. She began to experience a persistent, low-grade fatigue that sleep could not cure. There were vague, dragging pains in her pelvic region, symptoms that, in the medical ignorance of the 1950s, were easily dismissed as female troubles or the stress of adjusting to married life. But modern medical analysis reveals what her doctors missed or chose to ignore. This was the incubation period of pelvic inflammatory disease. The bacteria, likely chlamydia or gonorrhea, were beginning their silent ascent. Unlike a virus that attacks immediately, these pathogens work slowly. They colonized the cervix, then moved upward into the uterus. They were beginning to inflame the delicate lining of the endometrium, turning the soft, receptive tissue needed for a pregnancy into a scarred, hostile landscape. While this biological invasion was taking place, Jack was largely absent. His life was a whirlwind of Senate votes, speeches, and, crucially, continued infidelity. The marriage vow had not curbed his appetites, it had merely given him a cover. He continued to see other women, treating his marriage license as a diplomatic immunity that protected him from scandal. Every extramarital encounter was a reload. Every return to the marital bed was a potential reinfection. Jackie was living in a petri dish, her immune system constantly bombarded by new strains of bacteria brought home by her husband. The narrative of 1954 is dominated by Jack's spinal collapse, and this event is critical because it provided the ultimate cover for Jackie's deteriorating health. Jack's back pain had become so excruciating that he could barely walk. He was a cripple in a suit, relying on crutches that he would hide the moment a camera appeared. Desperate, he opted for a radical high-risk surgery, a spinal fusion. The surgery was a disaster. His body, weakened by Addison's disease, failed to heal. The wound became infected. He slipped into a coma. A priest was called to administer the last rites. For months, the Kennedy dynasty hung by a thread, and in the center of this maelstrom was Jackie. She transformed herself into the ultimate caregiver. She sat by his hospital bed at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York for weeks, holding his hand, reading to him, wiping his brow. She became the saintly figure the press adored. She helped him write profiles in courage during his recovery, polishing his legend while her own vitality drained away. This period acted as a massive distraction because the focus of the entire world and the entire Kennedy family was on Jack's survival. Nobody was looking at Jackie. Nobody noticed that she was growing thinner, paler, more fragile. Her own symptoms were swallowed by the magnitude of his crisis. If she complained of pain, it was selfish. If she was tired, it was because she was a devoted nurse. The narrative of Jack the survivor completely erased the narrative of Jackie the victim. The abuse was not just biological. It was now systemic neglect. She was saving the life of the man who was slowly killing her fertility. By 1955, Jack had recovered. He was back in the Senate, walking, and his political stock was soaring. The machine needed the next prop, a baby. The pressure on Jackie to conceive was crushing. It came from Joe Kennedy, who viewed a grandchild as a political asset. It came from the press, who speculated endlessly on her waistline. And it came from Jack, who needed to prove his virility after his brush with death. Jackie, desperate to cement the bond with her distant husband and to fulfill her own deep desire for motherhood, tried to conceive, and, miraculously, she did. In early 1955, the announcement was made. The Kennedys were expecting. For a brief window, there was joy. Jackie began to decorate a nursery. She bought clothes. She allowed herself to imagine a future where a child would anchor Jack to the home, curbing his wandering eye and softening his edges. But she did not understand the biological battlefield inside her own body. Conception is one thing. Retention is another. The fetus that was trying to grow inside Jackie was fighting a losing battle against the environment Jack had created. The inflammation in her uterus, the endometritis caused by the chronic bacterial infection, meant that the placenta could not implant deeply or securely. The blood supply to the fetus was compromised. The very walls of the womb, scarred and irritated, were rejecting the life they were meant to hold. The end came 3 months into the pregnancy. It did not happen with the dignity of a medical procedure. It happened with the violence of a trauma. Jackie began to bleed. The cramping was severe, far worse than ordinary pain, a hallmark of an inflamed reproductive tract expelling its contents. She was rushed to the hospital. The doctors, the best money could buy, were helpless. They could not stitch a cervix that was inflamed. They could not calm a uterus that was diseased. The pregnancy terminated. The first tiny grave of the Kennedy legacy was dug. It is here, in the aftermath of the miscarriage, that we see the true face of the marriage. A miscarriage is a profound physical and emotional trauma for a woman. It is a hormonal crash, a bereavement, a physical wounding. A husband's role is to offer comfort, to share the burden of grief. Instead of offering grief or pity, Jack reacted with cold annoyance. According to friends and aides present at the time, Jack seemed irritated by the messiness of it all. He visited her in the hospital, but his presence was perfunctory. He checked his watch. He talked about Senate business. To him, the miscarriage represented a functional failure of his wife rather than the death of a child. In his mind, conditioned by a lifetime of physical entitlement and medical concealment, bodies were machines that should do what they are told. Jackie's body had failed him. It had failed to produce the asset he required. There is a chilling anecdote from this period where Jack, shortly after the miscarriage, was seen at a dinner party, laughing and charming the room, completely unburdened by the tragedy. Meanwhile, Jackie was at home, recovering in a dark room, bleeding and empty. The disconnect was absolute. The 1955 miscarriage was the turning point. Before this, Jackie had been innocent, believing that love and duty would conquer all. After this, a hardness began to grow in her. She began to realize that she was alone. She realized that to Jack, she was a component of his life, like a suit or a speechwriter, expected to perform and not to break down. But she also internalized the guilt. The doctors, protecting the senator, never told her, "Your husband gave you an infection." They told her she had a weak constitution. They told her she was high-strung. They gaslit her into believing that her body was the problem. She took the blame onto herself, doubling down on her efforts to be healthy, to rest, to be perfect. She didn't know that the game was rigged. She didn't know that as long as Jack continued his lifestyle, which he did with renewed vigor after his recovery, she would never be safe. As 1955 drew to a close, the stage was set for an even greater tragedy. The couple was looking toward 1956, a presidential election year. The demand for a baby was louder than ever. Jackie would conceive again, but this time, the consequences of the toxic symbiosis would not just be a miscarriage. It would be a catastrophe that would bring her to the brink of death and force a cold, hard financial calculation that would change the nature of their marriage forever. The tragedy of Arabella was approaching, and the yacht was waiting in the Mediterranean. By the summer of 1956, the Kennedy machine was operating at full throttle. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago was approaching, and Jack Kennedy had his eyes fixated on the vice presidential nomination. He was young, he was charismatic, and he was selling a narrative of vitality that captivated the nation. But to secure the nomination, he needed more than just speeches. He needed the perfect tableau. He needed the image of the virile Catholic family man. Jackie was once again pregnant. This pregnancy, her second, was the cornerstone of Jack's political strategy for the year. A baby in the White House would soften his image and appeal to the crucial female demographic. For Jackie, however, this was not a political maneuver. It was a desperate, terrifying second chance. After the miscarriage of 1955, she was acutely aware of her body's fragility. She moved with caution, terrified that any sudden movement or stress would trigger another collapse. Her doctors, aware of her difficult history, but still ignorant of the underlying bacterial inflammation, advised rest. But rest was the one thing the Kennedy lifestyle did not permit. Jack was campaigning aggressively, and he expected Jackie to be by his side, smiling, shaking hands, and concealing her nausea and anxiety. She performed her duty, but as August approached and she entered her 7th month, the physical toll became undeniable. She retreated to Hammersmith Farm in Newport, Rhode Island, the Auchincloss estate, to wait out the final trimester in what she hoped would be a sanctuary. She assumed her husband would stay close. She assumed that, given the tragedy of the previous year, he would want to be near her to ensure this child survived. She was wrong. In mid-August, with his wife heavy with child and visibly exhausted, Jack Kennedy announced his plans. He was not going to stay in Newport. He was not going to hold vigil. Instead, he was going to Europe. Specifically, he had rented a luxury yacht to cruise the Mediterranean with his brother-in-law, actor Peter Lawford, and his Senate colleague, George Smathers. The decision was breathtaking in its callousness. It wasn't just a business trip. It was a bachelor party on the high seas. Jack framed it as a necessary rest after the grueling convention work, a way to recharge his batteries. But to Jackie, and to anyone observing with a moral compass, it was an act of abandonment. He was leaving a wife with a history of high-risk pregnancy to go partying with notorious womanizers. Jackie begged him not to go. She reportedly told him she felt unwell, that she had a bad feeling. Jack dismissed her fears as hysteria. He packed his bags, kissed her on the cheek, and flew to France to board the yacht. This moment is critical in understanding the hamartia of Jack Kennedy, his absolute inability to prioritize human connection over his own pleasure. He viewed his wife's pregnancy as a background process, something that would run on its own while he enjoyed the spoils of his status. While Jackie sat in the oppressive humidity of Rhode Island, Jack was living a technicolor fantasy on the blue waters of the Mediterranean. The yacht was a floating zone of hedonism. The atmosphere was one of boys being boys, drinking, gambling, and inevitably, women. The presence of Peter Lawford, a member of the Rat Pack, ensured that the supply of female companionship was constant. For Jack, this was freedom. Away from the prying eyes of the American press and the judgment of his wife, he could indulge his steroid-fueled libido without consequence. He was entirely disconnected from the reality back home. There is no record of him calling to check on Jackie's condition. In his mind, the baby wasn't due until late September. He had time. He felt invincible. But biology does not respect the schedules of senators. While Jack was toasting the sunset off the coast of Italy, the inflammation in Jackie's uterus was reaching a critical mass. On the morning of August 23, 1956, the biological bomb detonated. Jackie awoke at Hammersmith Farm in agony. It wasn't labor pains. It was something far more violent. She was hemorrhaging. She was rushed to Newport Hospital by her stepbrother, Yusha Auchincloss. The scene in the ambulance was horrific. Jackie was terrified, drifting in and out of consciousness, soaked in her own blood. Upon arrival, the doctors realized the gravity of the situation immediately. It was a placental abruption, a catastrophic event where the placenta prematurely separates from the uterine wall, depriving the baby of oxygen and causing massive internal bleeding for the mother. Medically, placental abruption is often linked to chronic inflammation or trauma. In Jackie's case, the hostile environment of her uterus, scarred by the silent infections transmitted by her husband, had likely failed to maintain the structural integrity needed to hold the placenta in place. The biological abuse was no longer silent, it was screaming. The doctors performed an emergency cesarean section to save Jackie's life. They worked furiously, cutting through tissue to reach the infant. They pulled the baby girl out. She was perfect, and she was dead. The baby, later named Arabella, had suffocated in the womb due to the abruption. Jackie, groggy from anesthesia, woke up to the sound of silence. There was no cry. There was only the hushed murmuring of nurses and the weeping of her mother. When they told her the baby was gone, Jackie didn't scream. She turned her face to the wall. A priest was called to the hospital room to baptize the lifeless body, a heartbreaking ritual for a devout Catholic. Jackie lay there, hooked up to blood transfusions, her body empty, her heart shattered. And in that room, The absence of her husband was a physical weight. The empty chair beside her bed was more than just a vacancy. It was an accusation. She was facing the darkest moment of her life, and the man responsible for it was 4,000 miles away, likely holding a drink. What happened next is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence in the case against Jack Kennedy's character. The news of the tragedy had to be relayed to the yacht. Communication in 1956 was difficult. It required a ship-to-shore radio patch. When the call finally came through, Jack was annoyed at the interruption. He was told, "The baby is dead. Jackie is critical." Any normal husband, any man with a shred of empathy, would have demanded the boat turn around immediately. He would have been on the first plane back. Jack Kennedy did neither. His reaction was chilling. He reportedly shrugged and told his companions that since the baby was already dead and Jackie was stabilized, there was no point in him rushing home. He was having a good time. He didn't want to ruin the trip. He actually proposed staying for the rest of the vacation. It was Senator George Smathers, a man not known for his own high morals, but who possessed a sharp political instinct, who intervened. Smathers was horrified, not just by the inhumanity, but by the political suicide Jack was about to commit. He literally cornered Jack on the deck. Smathers reportedly grabbed him and delivered an ultimatum. "You prefer to stay here with these girls? Fine. But if you don't go back to that girl in the hospital, every mother in America will hate you. You will never be president. You are finished." Neither grief nor love turned the boat around. It was purely the threat of losing votes. Jack Kennedy realized that the optics of a grieving mother alone in a hospital while her husband partied in the Mediterranean would destroy his carefully crafted image. Reluctantly, sulkily, he agreed to return. He arrived at Newport Hospital days later. He walked into Jackie's room, tanned, smelling of sea air, looking like a Greek god who had just descended from Olympus. He didn't fall to his knees. He didn't weep. He offered a casual, almost charming apology, as if he had been late for a dinner date, rather than missing the death of his daughter. But Jackie was no longer the naive girl from 1953. The anesthesia had worn off, and so had the illusion. Lying in that hospital bed, staring at the man who had abandoned her to die, something in her snapped. She saw him clearly for the first time. She saw the narcissism. She saw the emotional void. She realized that to him, she and Arabella were just props in his grand play, and damaged props were of no use to him. She didn't yell. She didn't throw things. She simply went cold. When she was discharged from the hospital, she didn't go back to their home in Washington. She retreated to her parents' house. She told her sister Lee Radziwill that she was done. She was going to file for divorce. The tragedy of Arabella had stripped away the last remnants of the fairy tale. The toxic symbiosis had produced a corpse, and Jackie was no longer willing to pay the price. She prepared to leave the Kennedy orbit forever, but she had underestimated one thing: the determination of Joe Kennedy Sr. to keep the show on the road. The divorce would not happen. Instead, a business transaction was about to take place. A transaction that would put a price tag on her womb and seal her fate for the next 7 years. In the autumn of 1956, the Kennedy dynasty faced a threat far more dangerous than any political rival or foreign power. The threat was silence. Jacqueline Kennedy had retreated behind the walls of her family's estate, refusing to speak to her husband, refusing to appear in public, and most critically, consulting with divorce lawyers. The tragedy of Arabella had not just broken her heart, it had broken the illusion of the marriage. She saw Jack not as a misunderstood boy, but as a sociopathic narcissist who had left her to bleed while he sailed the Mediterranean. For the Kennedy machine, a divorce was an extinction-level event. Jack was preparing to run for president in 1960. His entire platform was built on his identity as a wholesome Catholic war hero. In the conservative moral landscape of 1950s America, a divorced Catholic, especially one divorced by a sympathetic, grieving wife who had just lost a child, was unelectable. The Catholic vote, the bedrock of the Kennedy base, would vanish overnight. Jack Kennedy was terrified, but true to form, he did not know how to fix an emotional problem. He sent gifts, they were returned. He made phone calls, they went unanswered. He was a man who knew how to campaign, but he did not know how to apologize. Enter Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. If Jack was the face of the operation, Joe was the iron skeleton underneath. The patriarch of the clan was a man who did not believe in emotions. He believed in leverage. He had made his fortune in bootlegging, banking, and Hollywood, industries where contracts mattered more than feelings. He watched his son floundering and realized that Jack lacked the gravity to save his own marriage. Joe understood that Jackie was not just hurt, she was insecure. He knew her history. Her father, Black Jack Bouvier, had squandered the family wealth, leaving Jackie with a prestigious name but a constant gnawing fear of financial instability. Joe Kennedy viewed the marriage through a pragmatic lens, seeing it as a failing subsidiary company that needed a capital injection rather than a sacrament. He requested a private meeting with Jackie. He didn't go to offer condolences on the death of his granddaughter. He went to negotiate a purchase. The meeting between Joe Kennedy and Jackie is one of the pivotal, shadowed moments of the 20th century. It took place in a quiet room, away from the press and the lawyers. The atmosphere was not one of family reconciliation, but of a high-stakes boardroom merger. Joe was blunt. He did not try to defend Jack's behavior on the yacht. In fact, he reportedly acknowledged that his son was difficult and unlikely to change his wandering ways. He validated Jackie's pain, not out of empathy, but as a tactical concession to lower her defenses. Then, he put the offer on the table. He told Jackie that she was essential to the project, the making of the first Catholic president. Without her elegance, her class, and her image, Jack was just another gritty politician. He offered her a deal. If she agreed to stay, if she agreed to endure Jack's infidelities and maintain the public facade of the happy wife, he would ensure she never worried about money again. He offered to deposit $1 million into a personal trust fund for her. In today's currency, that is approximately $10 million. But there was a biological stipulation attached to the cash. It wasn't enough to just stay married. To secure the dynasty, she had to produce a healthy male heir. The contract explicitly linked her financial reward to her reproductive output. It was a cold, hard calculation. We will pay you for your pain, but you must give us a prince. Jackie was at a crossroads. She was 27 years old. She could leave, retain her dignity, but face an uncertain future as a divorcee with limited funds in a society that stigmatized broken marriages. Or she could stay. She could be the Queen of Camelot, the wealthiest woman in the room, and the wife of a future president. But the cost would be her autonomy. The cost would be accepting that her husband would never be faithful and that her body would remain the property of the Kennedy ambition. She looked at the check. She looked at the reality of her life, and she signed. This moment marked the death of the romantic Jackie and the birth of the icon we know today. She accepted the bribe. In doing so, she fundamentally altered the nature of the relationship. It was no longer a marriage based on hope. It was a professional partnership based on a transaction. She had sold her silence. She had sold her right to complain. She had agreed to re-enter the toxic symbiosis, knowing full well that the reservoir of infection in her husband had not run dry. She returned to Washington not as a healed wife, but as a paid employee of the Kennedy Corporation, with a very specific job description: look beautiful, say nothing, and breed. The reconciliation was staged for the cameras. Jack and Jackie appeared together, smiling, holding hands. The press sighed in relief. The fairy tale was back on track. But behind closed doors, the dynamic had shifted. Jackie now held a form of power. She had leverage. She spent the Kennedy money freely, redecorating their homes, buying couture clothing, and crafting an image of regality that intimidated even Jack. However, the biological imperative of the contract, the need for an heir, meant that the physical intimacy had to resume. And with the resumption of intimacy came the resumption of risk. Jack had not changed his lifestyle. If anything, the deal emboldened him. He felt he had paid for his freedom. He continued to see other women, his libido still turbocharged by his steroid regimen. For Jackie, every night in the marital bed was a roll of the dice. She was trying to conceive a child to fulfill her contractual obligation, while simultaneously risking reinfection from the very man she was contractually bound to. It was a grotesque biological lottery. In 1957, the contract yielded its first dividend. Jackie became pregnant again. This time, the anxiety was paralyzing. The memory of the miscarriage and the stillbirth of Arabella haunted her. She treated her body like a glass vessel. She withdrew from the social world, spending days in bed, terrified of another bleed, another failure. The doctors, finally sensing the high stakes, monitored her closely. But even then, they focused on rest rather than investigating the root causes of her previous losses. The inflammation was still there, lurking. On November the 27th, 1957, Caroline Bouvier Kennedy was born. She was healthy. The relief was seismic. Jack was ecstatic, not just as a father, but as a politician. The picture of him holding his daughter was political gold. It humanized him. It erased the rumors of the bachelor lifestyle. But for Jackie, the birth of Caroline was not just a joy, it was a reprieve. She had delivered. She had proven that her body wasn't entirely broken, but she also knew the contract wasn't fulfilled. Caroline was a girl. The dynasty demanded a boy. The pressure did not vanish, it merely shifted. She had survived the first round of the paid partnership, but the toxic symbiosis was far from over. The road to the White House lay ahead, and the physical toll it would extract from her would make the pain of 1956 seem like a prelude. The chemicals were about to enter the story in a new, terrifying way. By 1958, the Kennedy machinery was entirely focused on one singular objective: the White House. The plan, orchestrated by Joe Kennedy, required Jack to campaign across every state, shaking thousands of hands, standing for hours at podiums, and projecting an image of boundless youthful energy. But the biological reality was that the candidate was physically disintegrating. The public saw a bronzed, athletic senator. The medical files reveal a man who was often unable to put on his own socks. Jack's back was in constant revolt. His Addison's disease left him prone to sudden, debilitating fatigue, and the chronic prostatitis caused by his untreated venereal history continued to flare. The steroid regimen that had sustained him for a decade was no longer enough. He was a car running on empty, being driven at maximum speed. To bridge the gap between his broken body and his political ambition, the Kennedys needed a new kind of fuel. They found it on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in the office of a man who would become the Dark Wizard of Camelot. Dr. Max Jacobson was known in whispered circles as Dr. Feelgood. He was a physician who treated celebrities, artists, and the wealthy elite who needed to perform at high levels despite exhaustion. His method was unconventional, and by modern standards, criminal. He concocted a proprietary serum he called Miracle Tissue Regenerator. He claimed it was a blend of vitamins, enzymes, and animal placenta. In reality, forensic analysis of Jacobson's formula reveals that its primary active ingredient was methamphetamine, high-grade, liquid speed. Jack Kennedy met Jacobson in the run-up to the 1960 campaign. The effect was immediate. The injection provided a sudden euphoric rush of confidence and energy. It masked the pain. It banished the fatigue. It made Jack feel not just normal, but superhuman. He was instantly hooked. The secret to the Kennedy vigor, that electric quality that seduced voters, was not sailing or touch football. It was chemistry. Jack began carrying Jacobson's vials in his briefcase. He was now running the country's most grueling political campaign while managing a secret, high-functioning drug dependency. But the toxic symbiosis entered a new and terrifying phase when Jackie rolled up her sleeve. Until 1959, Jackie had been the victim of Jack's biology. She had absorbed his bacteria and suffered the consequences. But as the pressure of the campaign mounted, she began to absorb his chemistry as well. The role of the perfect candidate's wife was exhausting. She was expected to smile through the infidelities, travel incessantly, and radiate charm while battling her own chronic depression and the lingering physical trauma of her difficult pregnancies. Jack, seeing her struggle to keep up with his chemically enhanced pace, introduced her to Dr. Jacobson. He offered the shots as a solution to her fatigue, a pick-me-up to help her get through the day. And Jackie, desperate to numb the emotional pain and perform the duties of the contract she had signed, accepted. This is a pivotal psychological shift. They were no longer just husband and wife. They were now partners in a shared chemical secret. They would receive injections together before debates, before state dinners, before rallies. The methamphetamine artificially harmonized their rhythms. It masked the resentment. It allowed them to play the role of the golden couple with frightening intensity. The biological abuse had evolved. Jack was no longer just infecting her with bacteria. He was now the conduit for her addiction to amphetamines. The impact of this chemical warfare on history cannot be overstated. Consider the first televised presidential debate against Richard Nixon in September 1960. History tells us that Jack won because he looked better. He looked tan, relaxed, and confident, while Nixon looked pale, sweaty, and anxious. We now know that Nixon was recovering from a knee infection and refused makeup. Jack Kennedy, on the other hand, had received a treatment from Max Jacobson shortly before airtime. His healthy tan was partly a symptom of his Addison's disease and partly the result of afternoons on the campaign trail, but his supernatural calm and laser focus were chemically assisted. The American public was not choosing between two policies. They were choosing between a sick man who looked sick and a sick man who was high on methamphetamines and looked like a god. The drug masked the decay. It was the ultimate biological lie. Amidst this chemical whirlwind, the contract's primary clause remained unfulfilled: the male heir. In late 1960, just weeks after Jack won the election, Jackie went into labor. The birth of John F. Kennedy Jr. on November 25, 1960, was the crowning moment of the dynasty. A son, a prince for the new king. The nation celebrated. But for Jackie, the birth was another trauma. It was a cesarean section performed prematurely because her body could simply not hold the pregnancy to full term. Forensic medicine poses a disturbing question regarding the environment of that womb. It was a uterus scarred by chronic inflammation in a body flooded with stress hormones and, increasingly, amphetamines. John Jr. was born with respiratory distress, a precursor to the lung issues that would kill his younger brother 3 years later. Jackie had fulfilled her end of the bargain. She had delivered the boy. She had secured the legacy, but she was physically shattered. She entered the White House not as a triumphant First Lady, but as a woman suffering from postpartum depression, recovering from major surgery, and increasingly reliant on the vitamin shots that her husband swore by. As they crossed the threshold of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue on January 20th, 1961, the doors closed on the public. Camelot began. But inside, the White House became a biological pressure cooker. Dr. Jacobson was given a Secret Service code name. He was flown in on Air Force One. He treated the President and the First Lady in the private residence. The toxic symbiosis was now the State of the Union. The most powerful man on earth was navigating the Cold War while battling untreated venereal disease and steroid psychosis. The most admired woman on earth was hiding her trauma behind oversized sunglasses and chemical euphoria. They were beautiful, they were young, and they were slowly poisoning themselves and each other in the most exclusive house in America. The stage was set for the final tragic act of their reproductive drama, a tragedy that would expose the limits of what the human body can endure, even for a Kennedy. By 1961, the White House had been transformed into the world's most exclusive medical ward. To the American public, the Kennedy administration was defined by youth and vigor. Behind the scenes, it was defined by needles. Dr. Max Jacobson, the purveyor of the methamphetamine-laced miracle shots, was no longer just a visitor. He was a fixture of the executive branch. Secret Service logs from this period reveal that Jacobson made dozens of visits to the White House, often late at night or before major crises. Jack's dependence was absolute. During the Vienna summit with Nikita Khrushchev in June 1961, Jack was in crippling pain. His back was failing, and the stress of the Cold War was immense. He relied on the injections to remain upright and lucid, but the chemicals exacted a price. The crash after the amphetamine high made his mood volatile and his depression deeper. Jackie was trapped in this chemical cycle with him. She was under immense pressure to be the perfect hostess, the perfect mother, and the perfect diplomat. To cope with the exhaustion of her role and the emotional isolation of her marriage, she too continued the treatments. The toxic symbiosis was now chemically bonded. They were two high-functioning addicts living in a fishbowl, projecting an image of calm control while their internal chemistries were chaotic. If the chemicals masked the pain, they also eroded Jack's judgment. The inhibition that usually governs human behavior was stripped away by the steroid amphetamine cocktail. In the White House, Jack's sexual recklessness escalated from compulsive to pathological. He no longer limited his indiscretions to the campaign trail. He brought them into the family home. He utilized the White House swimming pool and the secretarial staff. He acted with a sense of invincibility, believing that the presidency and the loyal press corps would shield him from consequences. But he forgot that his wife was watching. Jackie was not oblivious. She knew the names. She knew the routines. The humiliation was no longer just private. It was becoming dangerously close to public exposure. The most flagrant example occurred in May 1962 at Madison Square Garden, when Marilyn Monroe sang "Happy Birthday" to the president in a dress that was essentially a second skin. It was a display of ownership, a public declaration of intimacy. For Jackie, who did not attend the gala, it was a slap in the face. The contract she had signed in 1956 promised financial security in exchange for silence, but it had implied a degree of discretion. Jack was breaking the rules of their arrangement. In the summer of 1962, the marriage was once again at a breaking point. The Monroe scandal and the relentless parade of women had pushed Jackie to the edge. She retreated to Ravello, Italy, spending weeks away from the White House, fueling rumors of a separation. The optics were disastrous. Jack, preparing for the looming 1964 re-election campaign, knew he could not survive a scandal of this magnitude while in office. He needed to bring her back. He needed to rebind her to the marriage. And in the Kennedy playbook, the solution to marital discord was often a grand gesture or a new distraction. The couple entered a period of tentative reconciliation. Jack promised to be more discreet. He promised to spend more time at the newly built home in Virginia, away from the temptations of D.C. And then a decision was made that defies medical logic. They decided to have another child. From a forensic medical perspective, the decision to conceive in late 1962 was a game of Russian roulette. The clinical picture of the mother was alarming. Jacqueline Kennedy was 33 years old. She had a history of 1 miscarriage, 1 stillbirth, and 2 difficult premature births. Her uterus was scarred. Her stress levels were stratospheric. She was periodically using amphetamines to manage fatigue. And the father, John F. Kennedy, was a walking catalog of pathology: Addison's disease, chronic back pain, venereal history, and severe drug dependency. Why did they do it? Perhaps they believed a baby would heal the wounds of the Monroe affair. Perhaps they wanted to secure the image of the growing American family. Or perhaps, blinded by the hubris of power and the false confidence of the drugs, they simply believed they could defy the odds. In early 1963, the announcement was made. The First Lady was pregnant. The public rejoiced. It was seen as a blessing, a sign of the vitality of Camelot. But in the privacy of the White House medical quarters, the mood was tense. The doctors knew the risks. They knew that Jackie's body was a hostile environment for a fetus. This pregnancy was different from the start. Jackie was fragile. She felt the ominous familiar cramping early on. The toxic symbiosis was being tested one last time. Jack, to his credit, seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. For the first time, he showed genuine concern, curbing his travel, checking on her. But it was too little, too late. The biological die had been cast years ago. The reservoir of infection, the years of stress and the chemical interference had created a physiological debt. And in August 1963, that debt would be collected in full. August 1963. The heat hung heavy over Cape Cod. The Kennedy clan had gathered at Hyannis Port, presenting the familiar tableau of sailing, swimming, and touch football. But for Jacqueline Kennedy, there was no play. She was sequestered at the rented Squaw Island estate, trying desperately to reach the final weeks of her pregnancy. She was due in September, but her body was already signaling distress. On the morning of August 7th, Jackie took the children, Caroline and John Jr., for a pony ride. It was a rare moment of normalcy. But by the afternoon, the pains began. They were sharp, rhythmic, and undeniable. She knew this feeling. It was the same biological alarm she had felt in 1955 and 1956. The labor was starting 5 weeks too soon. Jack was not there. He was in Washington, attending to the business of the state. Once again, Jackie faced a medical crisis with only the Secret Service and her personal staff to scramble for help. She was rushed by helicopter to the hospital at Otis Air Force Base. The déjà vu was suffocating. The scene at the base hospital was chaotic. The facility was not equipped for a high-risk neonatal delivery. The doctors performed an emergency cesarean section, Jackie's fourth C-section in 7 years. At 12:52 p.m., Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born. He weighed just 4 pounds, 10 ounces. To the untrained eye, he looked perfect. A miniature Kennedy with dark hair. But to the doctors, the signs were immediate and terrifying. He was struggling to breathe. His tiny chest was heaving, his color was poor. He was suffering from hyaline membrane disease, now known as respiratory distress syndrome. It is a disease of prematurity. But the prematurity itself was triggered because the uterine environment had become untenable. The inflammation, the stress hormones, the physical exhaustion of the mother, all factors present in Jackie's hostile environment, triggered the eviction notice before the baby's lungs were ready for the world. Patrick was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital, the best pediatric facility in the world. Jack arrived from Washington, his face a mask of terror. For the first time in their marriage, the political veneer was completely stripped away. The next 39 hours were a slow-motion torture. The doctors placed Patrick in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, a high-tech pressurized tank designed to force oxygen into his blood. Jack Kennedy, the most powerful man on earth, stood outside the glass, helpless. He watched his son gasping, fighting for every single breath. This was the reckoning. Jack could order nuclear strikes. He could move armies. He could seduce the world. But he could not command his son's lungs to open. He was forced to watch the ultimate consequence of the biological gamble they had taken. At 4:04 a.m. on August 9th, the struggle ended. Patrick died. Jack was the only family member in the room. He had slept on a cot next to the incubator. When the doctor shook his head, the President of the United States reportedly slumped over the incubator and began to sob. It was a guttural primal sound that his aides had never heard before. He put up quite a fight, Jack said. He was a beautiful baby. For Jackie, recovering at Otis Air Force Base, the news was delivered by Jack himself. He walked into her room, his eyes swollen, his back stooped in agony. They held each other. For perhaps the first time since 1953, there were no cameras, no voters, no contracts, just two broken parents in the wreckage of their ambition. The death of Patrick changed everything. It broke the cycle of the toxic symbiosis. Jack was profoundly shaken. He seemed to finally understand the cost. He became tender towards Jackie in a way he had never been. He held her hand in public, not for the cameras, but for support. He rescheduled meetings to be with her. The loss of Patrick seemed to burn away the narcissism, leaving behind a raw, grieving man. But for Jackie, the shift was darker. She fell into a deep, silent depression. She had paid the price again. She had fulfilled the contract, and the contract had delivered death. She looked at her husband and saw a man trying to repent, but she also saw the years of damage that could not be undone. She told a friend during this period, "I just can't bear any more. I have nothing left to give." She was right. She was empty. The biological abuse had run its course. There were no more babies to lose. There was only the final act of the tragedy left to play out. And it would happen not in a hospital, but on a sunny street in Texas, where the blood she had shed in private for a decade would finally be spilled in public. 3 months after Patrick's death, the Kennedys emerged from their grief. It was November 1963. The election of 1964 was looming, and the political cracks in Texas needed to be sealed. Jack asked Jackie to come with him. It was a rare request. Usually she avoided the gritty campaign trails, but this time she agreed. She wanted to support him. She wanted to re-enter the world after the darkness of the summer. On the morning of November the 22nd, she dressed in the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth. She chose a strawberry pink Chanel suit with navy lapels and a matching pillbox hat. It was vibrant, youthful, and expensive, the perfect armor for the Queen of Camelot. When she stepped out into the Texas sun, the crowds went wild. Jack was beaming. For a few brief hours, the toxic symbiosis seemed to have finally found a balance. They looked like a couple who had weathered the storm and come out the other side, stronger and more united. But the storm hadn't passed. It was waiting on Elm Street. At 12:30 p.m., the biology of John F. Kennedy, the back that required a brace, the adrenal glands that required steroids, the blood that carried his secrets, ceased to matter. 3 shots rang out. The Zapruder film has been analyzed for decades for ballistics and trajectories. But through the lens of this marriage, the footage reveals something else. The final violent collision of their physical realities. When the fatal shot struck, the biological containment field of the president exploded. Jackie did not scream immediately. She climbed onto the trunk of the limousine. History has often misinterpreted this as an attempt to escape. It was not. She was reaching for a piece of his skull. In that moment of absolute horror, her instinct was primal and heartbreaking. She was trying to put him back together. She was trying to fix the unfixable, just as she had tried to fix his image, his health, and his family for 10 years. She held his shattered head in her lap as the car sped toward Parkland Hospital, her pink suit absorbing the blood of the man who had caused her so much pain. At Parkland Hospital, the president was pronounced dead. The king was gone. But the widow remained. And here lies the most powerful moment of her life. As the Secret Service and the aides swarmed around her, urging her to leave, urging her to rest, their primary concern became the optics. They looked at her suit, caked in blood, bone fragments, and gray matter, and they recoiled. It was too gruesome. It was too real. They begged her to change. They had clean clothes ready. They wanted to scrub the horror away, to present a sanitized, mournful widow to the waiting world. Jackie Kennedy said no. She refused to wipe her face. She refused to take off the suit. She wore it on the ride back to the airport. She wore it as she boarded Air Force One. She wore it as she stood next to Lyndon B. Johnson while he took the oath of office in the cramped cabin of the plane. When Lady Bird Johnson asked if she wanted to clean up, Jackie delivered the line that serves as the epitaph for the Kennedy marriage. No, let them see what they have done. Let them see who is them. It was not just Lee Harvey Oswald. It was not just the city of Dallas. In that moment, Jackie was forcing the entire world to look at the gore. For a decade, she had been paid to hide the ugliness. She had hidden the venereal diseases. She had hidden the miscarriages. She had hidden the stillbirths. She had hidden the drug addiction, and she had hidden the emotional abuse. She had been the beautiful curtain that covered the rotting window, but now she tore the curtain down. By wearing that blood-stained suit, she was turning herself into a mirror. She was forcing the public, the Kennedy family, and history itself to stare at the visceral, disgusting reality of violence and death. The suit was the external manifestation of her internal reality. A beautiful, expensive fabric, hopelessly stained by the corruption of the man she married. It was her final act of defiance. It was a visual punishment inflicted on a world that had demanded a fairy tale and received a massacre. The verdict on Camelot is clear. Far from a golden age, it was a gilded cage. John F. Kennedy was a man of immense talent and charisma, but he was also a biological hazard. He was a product of a system that taught him he could outrun consequences, that he could drug his way through pain, and that he could use human beings as fuel for his ambition. His tragedy is that he had the potential for greatness, but his lack of discipline, his hamartia, corrupted the very vessel of his legacy, his family. And Jacqueline Kennedy? She was the ultimate survivor. She walked away from the wreckage with her life, but she left behind a graveyard of potential children and a part of her own soul. She was a victim of a sophisticated form of abuse. Abuse by microbe, by money, and by neglect. But she was also a participant. She signed the contract. She took the needle. She played the part. The story of the toxic symbiosis teaches us a brutal lesson about power. It reminds us that the shiny images of history are often polished with sweat and blood. Camelot existed, yet far from being a castle in the clouds, it was a beautiful, terrifying house of cards, built on a foundation of silence, held together by chemistry, and destined to collapse under the weight of its own secrets.